Hello, this is Justin Williams with the Wolfpacker Podcast. I'm joined today, as always, by co-host Matt Carter. And today we have a very special guest, local radio talk show host on 99.9 The Fan, Joe Giglio of the OG. And we have him on to talk a little bit about his new podcast project that they've got going on over there called Never Failed, the Russell Wilson Story. It's a 6-part podcast, a really great listen. You can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts, so definitely go check it out. Before we get too far into this episode, got to introduce our advertiser. As we blitz into 2021, JFQ Lending wants the Wolfpacker.com members to take advantage of historically low mortgage rates. JFQ Lending has a Better Business Bureau A rating with over 2,000 reviews. They work with top lenders and do the hard work of finding the best deal for you. If you're curious whether refinancing your mortgage is a good decision, visit jfqlending.com today. That's jfqlending.com. And while you're at it, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, Apple Podcast app, Spotify, Google Play. Plus, you can watch us on our YouTube channel, where you should subscribe to our YouTube channel and give this video a thumbs up. So, Joe, thanks again for coming on the show today to talk a little bit about the Russell Wilson podcast. It was a great listen. Just finished up the 6th episode yesterday. So I just want to kind of get your insight as to what kind of gave you this idea to come up with this podcast, and maybe why now to do this podcast. I guess enough time has passed that you can kind of look back on this situation as a historical event rather than kind of a, recent memory, since it's been 10 years now.
Yeah, that's the most amazing part. And thank you, Matt, and thank you, Justin, for having me on. I appreciate it. It does make you feel old when you start realizing that it's been 10 years and even 5 years since the Wisconsin graduation speech. So to me, the idea came about because it was really during the football season. And when Seattle and Russ got off to such a hot start, invariably it will always come back to, well, what happened at NC State? How did he leave NC State? They cut him. They got rid of him. They kicked him off the team. And the story really has never, in my opinion, been told completely. And a big part of that, of course, was the graduation speech from 2016 that Russell Wilson gave at Wisconsin, where he was rather loose with the facts. And people have just kind of adopted that as the truth. And I've always felt that there was a better way, a more complete way to tell the story. And based on my own experience during that time, and just based on being able to talk to some of the people that were there, Elliot Avent, Mike Glennon, Mark Trespin, who I really had no idea had such a important role in Russell's career and path. So certain things like that really stood out to me, and I was glad to get the people that we did who talked to us. I thought they were really honest and worked out really well from our side. And then obviously I was at the News and Observer during that time, and now to be at WRAL and 99.9 The Fan and to have access to those archives really tied the whole thing together. So great work, not only by Jason Jennings at WRAL to find all of those clips, but by Joe Ovius, who did the podcast with me, to remember the different interviews that he had, not only with Russell Wilson, but with Tom O'Brien, and to be able to put those together in a way that it would make a narrative sense. So that's a long way of saying, I think you used the word historical correctly, and that was kind of what we were shooting for. Anytime the story needs to be told now, we can just send a link and say, here you go. It's not all that simple, and that's how you end up with 6 episodes. So that part of it in particular, I'm proud of.
Let me ask you, how did you get the, we'll talk about some of the stuff you learned and rehash some of it in a minute, but getting these guys to participate, Mike, Wayne Crawford, Brandon Bishop, Elliot Avent, Mark Trestman, Mike Archer. I think I've hit on a lot of the main ones you talked about. What was that like? What that process like? Did you have to sell them on it, or were they eager to talk about it? And how did it come together?
Yeah, we'll start with the two easiest ones. Obviously, I have a pretty good relationship with Mike Glennon, and I have a very good relationship with Elliot Avent. So they were the easy ones. And really, it was just explaining to them this was my interest and this was how I wanted to do it. And once you start talking, it's like any other story that you guys have done. Once you start talking to people, you ask them, like, who would be good to talk to? And then they give you people. And then they kind of tell, you know, like a Mark Tressman, who I never really had known. No. Elliot would say, hey, Joe's doing this project. He's going to treat you fairly, and I think it's worth you helping him out, is basically what it comes down to. I had never talked to Wayne Crawford before. So it was great to talk to him. Aaron Henry, as you guys all know from being an assistant at NC State, you get like this small world type of situation where you realize, oh man, he was at Wisconsin. So that part of it kind of all came together once we started talking. But obviously Mike and Elliot, I think I talked to Mike for 90 minutes for the podcast. I talked to Elliot for 75, 80 minutes. And we just sat back over here in the studio, and we just basically went through it chronologically, because it was really the only way you could keep track of it. And then, you know, and I told them all, like, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to talk and get all this audio, and then we'll put it together in a way that makes sense. So really, without Mike and Elliot, it would not have happened.
Joe, I really like the way. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say real quick, you mentioned, I think listeners know that you had a great relationship with Tom O'Brien, too.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why this story is all based on that Wisconsin perception has been based on the Wisconsin graduation. Of course, Tom won't ever, other than one media availability around the Super Bowl when he was at Virginia, he's never really dived into the topic. And I think he's always had the attitude of, there's nothing for me to gain by getting into it. Do you think he was ever entertained? I know you talked to him. Did he come close to agreeing to participate, or did you think he was never going to hop into it?
So, so when I would reach out to people, yeah. It really was like a Bond villain. I would explain what I was doing. It was like one of these really long texts that you get, and you're like, why are you sending me why are you sending me 600 words in a text, Giglio? Yeah. But I immediately knew I made a mistake when I texted Tom at first instead of calling him. Right. And he did not respond to me. So I called him, and I knew he wasn't going to pick up the phone because he knew what I was calling about. So I left him a very curt and explicit voicemail that started with "listen," and then I'll let you fill in the blank. I said, "You owe me a phone call," and that was a Friday. Monday morning at about 7:15, he called me, and he goes, "What are you, the Lone Ranger? Well, who do you think you are?" I said, and I told him, I said, "Well, I made a mistake in texting you. I should have just called you. And I knew you weren't going to do it, but I thought maybe I could sweet talk you into it." And he was like, I don't know if I told the story on the podcast or not. So the original text was, it's been 10 years, blah, 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 blah. Right. So I said now I'm on the phone with Tom, and I said, it's been 10 years. I'm like, let's just get this straight. Let's just get it right. And he goes, no, nobody cares. Nobody's interested. And I said, yes, they are. No, they are. And he goes, okay, I'll do it in 25. I go, you want me to wait 15 more years? He goes, no, we'll do it in 25 years. And I said, awkward silence. You're not going to be here in 25 years. He goes, that's the point. So I said, all right, just so you know, if you don't come on the podcast, I will have to tell my stories then from our time and our conversations. And he goes, which ones? So the Tyler Brocious one notably was one of those. And he's like, oh, there were some other words involved in that one. And I said, I'll clean it up. Don't worry. So, and then he once I found out that Russ was coming back for the NC State graduation speech, I had reached back out to Tom and I said, well, hopefully this time you don't have a country accent. And he called me back and he's like, well, and I did include what he said on that one, because I was like, why don't you just tell me, you didn't call him son, right? You didn't, there's certain things I know he didn't say. Now, the part about telling him that they were moving on, and he might have even told him to give it up football and concentrate on baseball. That part of Russell's graduation speech, I actually don't think he embellished. But obviously the accent and maybe some of the other parts of it he did. So I just said, why don't you just come on and clear some of that up? And he goes, it doesn't matter what I said. Whatever Russell heard, Russell believes whatever he heard. So it doesn't matter what I said. I said, okay, I'll use that. He said, fine, you could say that. So yeah, I probably talked to him 3 different times during the podcast. And each time it was kind of like, and then by that point, both Glennon and Bishop were kind of challenging me, like, I can't believe you can't get Tom. And it's like, all right, I'll try again. So they were kind of needling me at that point. So
sure.
Joe, I've got a ways to go in my journalism career before I feel comfortable reaching out to sources, listen, fill in the blank.
Yeah, you can imagine what it was. It is what you think it was.
Yes, right. A ways to go is what I'm saying here. But I've got a couple questions.
Well, that actually is a callback with Tom, and Matt will remember this. After they lost to Maryland in 2010, they lose the game that cost them essentially the ACC title. I wrote in the News and Observer like the next day that at NC State, you have to make hay while the sun shines. And, NC State let an opportunity go in losing this game. And the next day, for whatever reason, I run into Tom at Clues Coney Island. And he thought I had gotten the message that he was relaying through Annabelle to me. And he goes, did Annabelle tell you? And I said, what? He said, the sun, Tom wanted Annabelle to call me and say, listen, name,
yeah,
the sun's going to shine for a long time. And I said, no. I said, Annabelle did call me, but what she said was, Coach is not very happy with you. And he subsequently tells Annabelle, he's from New Jersey. You could use those words with him. He's not going to get mad at you. And so that is ultimately why I chose that tack with Coach O'Brien.
Sure.
Okay, so a couple things you said there leads me to my next question, because you brought up the Wisconsin graduation speech. You brought up the country accent. You also brought up the fact that you're from New Jersey, but you've been here long enough to know the local dialect. And you've also been around Tom O'Brien enough to know how he talks. So I know the fact that Tom O'Brien does not have a quote-unquote country accent, but how would you rate Russell Wilson's country accent? If you had to give it a grade between 1 and 10, what numeric value would you give Russell Wilson's country accent?
As an exaggerated lampoon, I would give it a 10. Russ grew up in Richmond. I mean, this is not anything new for him. But truly, I think what Russell didn't understand, and I've made this point several times, either on the podcast or on my radio show, by choosing to paint O'Brien in the way that he did, he made it seem like that's how he was portraying NC State. And whether that's what he was trying to do or not, that was the result of what he was doing. And I think he alienated more NC State fans in that speech than he realized, which is why I thought it was great for him to come and do the graduation speech at NC State this month, which I thought was a great message. And if you go back and actually listen to the entirety of the Wisconsin speech, he had a great message that day too, but he clouded it with the accent, and then the baseball details were ridiculous. And to be perfectly honest with you, Justin, that's why the podcast was made. I do have a great relationship with Elliot, and I know what Elliot did for Russell Wilson, and I know, even though he didn't name him in that speech, he had no business using Elliot or his baseball career as a prop to get a cheap cheer at Camp Randall Stadium. It was completely unnecessary. And I know I'm not the only person who has felt that way. So that really was a big part of everything.
I never thought I'd say this, but you're actually a more generous grader than I am, because I'd give it like a 4. He's from
on the
Virginia.
Lampoon scale. On the Lampoon
But even
scale,
the Lampoon scale, like,
Steve.
I've lived in North Carolina my entire life. I could put together a better country accent than that. That was like a guy from Wisconsin putting together a country accent. So I don't know. Maybe he'd spend enough time up in Seattle at that point. But my next question was going to be, I really liked how you guys painted the perspective of both O'Brien and Russell, I thought, very equally and fairly through your sourcing. And I think it's something that if this was done by a national outlet, it probably would have been a little bit more skewed towards Russell's perspective, just because they wouldn't have gone through the sourcing to get Tom's perspective. But you knew this story really well. You were around the area. You were covering it. What were some things that you learned this go around with your research and your most recent conversations with some of these interviews that you had?
Yeah, Mark Trestman, I knew through Elliot, had a very high opinion of Russell Wilson. I did not know, actually, until reading Matt's article about how Russ got to NC State. I didn't realize Mark had the workout that he did at NC State before the camp. We all knew about the camp, but Matt's article really was the first time I knew about that specific workout. And then when Mark said that he gave him a 3rd-round grade based on that workout, as a 17-year-old kid, like throwing out routes, I was like, some of it didn't make the podcast in the sense that I don't have a background with Mark Trestman. And if I played it for Matt, it would sound very familiar to him in the sense that I'm giving Mark Trestman a hard time, and most people who know me know I'm giving you a hard time. But Mark Trestman was just kind of like, yeah. Yeah. And I'm like, he was talking about his leadership, and he was talking about how he gave him this very specific grade. And I'm like, you got all of this out of a workout in shorts against no defense? And he's like, yeah. I was like, wow. I did not know, and I should have, that Mark Trestman worked with Pete Carroll twice in the NFL. And I don't think I need to connect many dots to say I think Mark's recommendation to Pete is the reason Seattle drafted Russell in the first place. Notwithstanding the outstanding season that they had at Wisconsin, you still need someone to kind of push you in a direction to take a 5'10" quarterback. And Mark Trestman, I never knew was that big of an advocate of Russell, and also met with Russell here in Raleigh before Russell ended up choosing Wisconsin over Auburn. So I didn't know any of those things. Kyle Wilson, who's actually now kind of sort of a fellow CBC employee. He's the hitting coach at the Durham Bulls. I didn't realize about his relationship with Russ and the time that he would go to Wisconsin games and the Rose Bowl, and the great anecdote that he told about when Russ lost in the Rose Bowl. He immediately pointed out to Kyle, you know, Drew Brees lost in the Rose Bowl, but won the Super Bowl. And I was like, that sounds exactly like something that Russ would say. And I think that's also one thing that people maybe nationally don't realize, but, you know, people like Matt, James Henderson, JC, Ken Tishins, they would all know Russell's been exactly the same way in his unrelenting belief in himself, not in a cocky way, but in a, this is what's going to happen. I know Matt was there the day when Russ came back in 2012 before the draft. And Matt can tell you, there's not many times where I'm at a loss for words in a media setting. But when Russ told us, I'm going to be in the NFL for 12 to 15 years, and I'm going to win multiple Super Bowls, I was kind of like, I would just be worried about getting there. You know what I mean? Like, that would be my mindset. Can I get drafted? Can I get in the NFL? Can I get a job? And that wasn't even on his radar. It was, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this. And sure enough, that's always been his way. He has, and that's why I thought the graduation speech was so good, to have a vision. He's always had a vision for what he thinks he can do, and he's never let anyone tell him that he can't do it.
I want to kind of get to one of the points. I liked in the last episode, you ended it with, did Tom O'Brien or NC State do Russell Wilson wrong? And I think sometimes people forget, there's two different elements of the story. You can say, did Tom O'Brien make the right decision or the wrong decision? That's one debate. Then there's the debate of, did NC State screw Russell Wilson? Did they treat him wrong? Did they do him wrong? And I thought that was one of the best questions. And I thought Mike Glennon had the best answer of, maybe all sides involved had a role to play in this. What's your impression? I don't know if you had an opinion or if you stated it, but did NC State do Russell Wilson wrong, or was this, in my opinion, it was an inevitable conclusion almost?
It was. And the mind-boggling part for me, and the point I ultimately take away from the entirety of the situation, is that Tom O'Brien was right about Russell Wilson making a commitment. Because once Russell Wilson gave up baseball, his football career took off. I mean, there's absolutely no denying that. Now, did Tom magnanimously make this point and be incorrect? No. He should have handled that situation better. He should have. Bottom line. But what people conflate is what Russell has become and compare that to what Mike has become and say, well, heck, even if you had 2 years of Mike, you'd still want 1 year of a Hall of Fame NFL quarterback, a Super Bowl winning quarterback. And you could still say that, but one thing I already knew, and one that was kind of reinforced by talking to some different people, Tom really believed that Russell would have been better if he was at spring practice, if he was at off-season workouts. That ECU game in particular, like, he never got over. The Maryland game in particular, and Russ was not good against ECU. Maryland, he was fine. But in Tom's mind, it was, we lost these games very specifically because you weren't here. And his thought process at that time was, I know I'm going to have Mike here the whole time, and I know Mike is going to be a good college quarterback, which he was. So I think the answer, did NC State do him wrong? That kind of gets you to, he had a scholarship, and then all of a sudden he didn't have a scholarship. You know, but it's like being a parent. Your kid does something, you give a kid a choice, or you tell a kid, here are the rules, and then they don't follow the rules. Well, is it your fault as the parent? Or did the child do something where you're like, this is, you know, the action, and here's the consequence? Yeah. Russell's consequence was not committing. Now, I think we explained fairly clearly in the podcast why he never gave up baseball. He thought that was his future, for his professional future, for a couple of years there. And I do think one thing that either people didn't know beforehand, or maybe had to be reminded of, Tom tried after the 2010 season to get him into the combine. Yeah. And Tom knows Bill Belichick. Tom has a really good relationship with Bill Belichick. Tom knows NFL people. And they were like, we're good. So I think that fateful phone call during the minor league baseball game, I think that phone call was Tom explaining to Russell, this is what the NFL is telling me. Right. And I think Russell has just kind of taken that as that's what Tom thought of me. Now, Tom had his thoughts about Russell's the way he played quarterback. There's no doubt about that. And that's where I say about Russell with the graduation speech, like, I don't doubt Tom said some of those things to him. We just know it wasn't in the voice that it was it was given him.
And to your point, I'm not sure Russell Wilson comes to NC State if it wasn't for Elliott Avent in baseball. I honestly, from talking to him, I think he would have gone, if it was just a football decision, I'm not so sure he wouldn't have gone to Duke, which was really his other option at that point. And Chuck Amato. You know, I think and that's the other thing I think I felt like we did a pretty good job illustrating. One of the biggest reasons Russell ended up leaving was because the coaches who got him there weren't there anymore. Yeah.
You know? I mean, think about it. We see this all the time with ADs and coaches. We see this all the time in our own careers where you get a new boss and then all of a sudden you're like, I don't really like working for this guy. And now all of a sudden you're working somewhere else. It happens all the time. But for whatever reason, we always confuse our NC State coach and quarterback lineage, right? Chuck Amato didn't recruit Phillip Rivers. Certainly benefited from Phillip Rivers. Tom O'Brien didn't recruit Russell Wilson. Certainly benefited from Russell Wilson. So one of the many quirks of NC State.
Here's what I was going to say too. This is where I think both sides may have gotten mixed up. I blame Tom, and you can correct me if you think I'm right or wrong. I blame Tom O'Brien for I told Justin this, moving the goalpost a little bit on Russell each year with baseball. I remember the very first question I ever asked Tom O'Brien with his first spring, Russell Wilson was going to be his first spring. And I said something about, is Russell going to play football or baseball this spring? And Tom looked me dead in the eye and said, he's on a football scholarship, right? And it was a very terse, because Tom's as professional as it gets. I mean, he's very good at giving you answers that really aren't answers at a press conference and all of that jazz. But I later found out he had just had that conversation with Elliott Avent.
With Elliott.
Talked about it on the podcast.
Speaking of terse, yes.
Yeah. And then the next year they let him split. They relented. Yeah. Okay, you can play half spring, half the time with baseball, half the time with football. Then the third year, Tom let him do spring football, baseball. And I know he was a little bit annoyed that Russell Wilson wasn't playing every day because I think he thought if I let him play baseball, they would let him play every day.
Right.
And then the last year, it went all the way back to the other side of the pendulum of you got to give it up if you got to commit. Supposedly, allegedly, that was the ultimatum. On the flip side of that, I think Russell, like Mike Glennon said, didn't call the bluff. He thought he was bluffing almost. I think Russell thought Tom O'Brien was bluffing. You know Tom. I know Tom. Tom's not a bluffing man.
No.
And, I remember I sent you the link. Back in 2009, he was talking about Russell was only going to be there for a couple more years unless his baseball career falls apart. And to peel back the curtain, I remember I actually overheard a conversation at a football camp where Dana Bible was talking to a quarterback recruit up in the tower above me, going over how Russell was going to be there for one more year after he got drafted. And then they were going to go to Mike Glennon for 2 years, and then you would have an opportunity to be a 3-year quarterback as you redshirted.
Yeah.
So I felt like they were clear what they thought was going on, and maybe Russell thought that they were bluffing, but maybe Tom gave him reason to think he was bluffing based on how he was handling baseball. Is that a fair theory?
I think so. And also I think one part I wish, and I reached out to him, I wish Dana Bible would have joined me on the podcast. Because you remember Tom truly was a CEO. Like, he wasn't involved in the daily goings-on of the players. Bishop will always kind of give me a hard time and say, you talked to Tom more than I did. Like, that's the way Tom was. He let his position coaches really handle everything. And obviously Tom trusted Dana more than anybody else. particularly when it came to quarterbacks. So
for good reason.
I think there would have been some insight there. And I think I know the answer why Dana didn't do it. He's actually been working with Russell Wilson this offseason. So
Wow.
it's kind of a full circle one there on that.
Yeah. Do you think Russell kind of putting a lot of this behind him finally? I mean, I don't know if he'll ever forgive Tom O'Brien, but
and that's okay. That's kind of what my whole point was. Russell has earned every right to dunk on Tom O'Brien, absolutely. But the way that he did it in 2016, like I said, made NC State seem like this backwoods, country, slow people who don't have the internet. Like, we can't look up the number of at-bats you had in college. Like, huh?
This is North Carolina, Joe. So
I know, but I think Sierra has been a great influence on him. That was I could not have been more impressed with the speech this one at NC State. I thought he hit all the notes. I thought it was really good.
It almost seems like the speech that he just gave at NC State was almost a sense of closure. And it makes it so weird that your podcast came out ahead of time. Or, I mean, you guys had this plan before you knew that Russell Wilson was going to do the graduation speech. So, I mean, kind of just a crazy coincidence there.
It was a gift from Russell and the podcast gods, for sure.
Never failed. Never failed.
It never has.
I was going to ask a couple hypotheticals for your opinion, because kind of the conclusion of the story is that both sides kind of mutually benefited from this. I mean, I know NC State fans probably have more of a gripe with it because there's the what if Russell stayed, which is exactly what I'm going to ask you, Joe, for your opinion. If Russell stayed, do you think it makes a difference in 2011? Because Mike Glennon was a really good college quarterback.
Yeah, I would say this. I don't think NC State would have been 2-3 at the beginning of the 11 season, which is how they started. I think with Rush, I can't imagine they're much worse than 4-1, given the opponents there. But when you go back and look at that 2010 season, and I actually played golf with a couple of really big, huge NC State fans yesterday. And I said to them, that 2010 season, like, I don't know how you do it. How do you remain an NC State fan after that 2010 season? Because you lose to Virginia Tech after being up 14-0 on a pick six and a kickoff return. Not a great – Virginia Tech won the ACC that year, but they weren't a great team. Lose to just a super average ECU team. Now, they had Lincoln Riley. Great coach. Yeah. Lose to a Clemson team that beat that year they beat Florida State in the the original butt fumble game, the Christian Ponder butt fumble game.
Right.
They beat a good Carolina team, super talented defensive team, and all they got to do is tie their shoes against Maryland, which has not one single thing to play for. It's very important to note. Maryland did not end up being the ACC champions. They did not end up winning the Atlantic Division. They had nothing to play for. They were down 14-0. Why? How?
Yeah.
It's like missing a 3-footer to win the Masters. Like,
it really.
There were two decisions two decisions that season really stand out. One, the decision to punt on 4th and 1 at the Clemson 35-yard line. It ended up being a 4-yard punt or something ridiculous like that. And the decision to try to guard Torrey Smith with Audie Cole in the slot and never seemingly making the adjustment, even after maybe the second touchdown catch, maybe the third one you might want to consider trying something new at that point. But I will say that 2011 team defense had a lot of problems, and when I look at, I mean, Cincinnati scored. You were probably at that game in Cincinnati. I mean, they could have scored 100 on NC State that day if they wanted to. And
they had a lot of injuries that year, especially on the offensive line.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Justin. Good question. You want to say yes, but Clemson at that point had Sammy Watkins and Nuke Hopkins, and Taj Boyd was really good. Like, that wasn't and Mike beat them. Tom and Mike beat them in 11, but that was a really good team. So that's kind of the thing about 9 and 10 is that Florida State and Clemson weren't what they are or were going to be in the case of Florida State in that little run under Jimbo. And then Clemson had not figured out the secret magic yet. So,
and then on the other side of it, would you say that Russell would still have the same career that he's had today had he stayed in 2011? Does he go on to get drafted by the Seahawks and have this great NFL career? Or does he go end up in the major leagues?
I don't think so. I think he would have ended up back with the Rockies. And I don't know what would have happened because at that point he would have been concentrating on baseball. Yeah. And even though he couldn't hit early, I mean, reps, he was a talented enough athlete. If he had concentrated on baseball, I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that he could have made it. I really, that's my opinion. But if he didn't have the transition to Wisconsin, playing in that offense, behind that offensive line, in that spotlight, I think he's I don't think he gets drafted. I just don't.
Because it also turned him into a brand name, like a national brand
and
name.
They did that too. Right. Yeah, and he was voted team captain within weeks of being on the camp. Like, that's nuts. Like, that's amazing.
Right.
And that impressed scouts. The way he picked up their offense impressed scouts. The way he was able to play behind a line of that size and caliber impressed scouts. So, yeah, I mean, that was one thing that Kyle Wilson said. Russ may never admit it, but it truly was maybe the best thing that ever happened to him.
Yeah.
Matt, any other Russell Wilson questions?
Yeah, I have one more. How much do you think the fact that Russell Wilson wasn't really Tom O'Brien's guy, you think that played into it any? Because I remember, look, I wrote the story about how he came to NC State. It wasn't the smoothest coaching transitions and recruiting. A lot of people don't remember this. Tom O'Brien actually tried to recruit over Russell Wilson in that class. He brought in Matt Sims, Chris Sims' little brother, and Phil Sims' other son for an official visit that January, even though he had Russell Wilson committed. And I remember when Mike Glennon signed, he was talking about him at ACC kickoff, and he looked at me, he was talking about him, and then he turned his head and looked me straight in the eye and said, I think he was the best quarterback in the 2008 class. I don't care what the rankings show. So don't let it be known that they don't pay attention to the rankings. He looked me dead in the eye when he said that. They thought Mike Glennon was going to be the truth, and then Matt Ryan. And they had doubts about Russell Wilson all along. Do you think that played a role in how everything went down?
I think each time they thought Mike could beat out Russell rose to the occasion. Yeah. And and that's where Dana's insight probably would have come in. Not that Dana doesn't have a great relationship with Mike, but it ultimately came about, well, who's going to help us win the most games? I honestly think early on, those first 2 or 3 years, Tom knew the offensive line was not good enough to put Mike out there. Right. And I think that was also part of the decision. By that 4th year, he felt more comfortable with where the line was going to be at, and that he felt like he could put Mike out there. So I think that's part of it too. But yeah, there's no doubt in my mind. As I said on the podcast, we all have a type, right? They had a type, and the classic drop back pocket passer, Mike fit their type. And I think Russ, in his own way, kind of won them over based on his performance. And That part of it, I don't have any, I don't think they were never going to put Mike out there for the sake of just putting Mike out there. I'll put it that way. And they were, stubborn for sure, but not to the point of saying Russ didn't beat him out fair and square.
Joe, I don't want to take up too much more of your time here, but I did want to ask you while we have you about some other current events going on in NC State athletics, specifically with basketball. Obviously, the transfer portal has been really crazy this offseason. Of course, the most recent buzz, the rumors, whatever you want to call them, is that Manny Bates could potentially leave. Now, he's reported to be at team meetings. Who knows what's going on there, really? But my first question is, how much is college basketball in trouble with the transfer portal situation? I want to know your perspective on that, because I think there's differing opinions whether, you're pro the players having the power to transition as they please, which I would put myself in that camp. And you've got some older fans that really don't like where this is going with it. And B, how much is NC State in trouble if Manny Bates does end up transferring?
I don't mind the portal. I think players should be able to leave. But I think the unintended consequence in this particular year of the portal has been players are basically have changed the power dynamic with their coach, in the sense that in the old days, whatever days you want, a coach could control your playing time. A coach could make you run extra laps. A coach could bench you for a game. A coach could suspend you for a game. Whatever they felt necessary to motivate you and get them to, again, you have to kind of think of it as a parental situation. You're the parent and you're establishing rules. And when the kid doesn't listen, well, what are you supposed to do as a parent? If you let them get away with it once, they're going to do it the rest of the time. I think that dynamic changed this year in the sense that players felt like, oh, you're not going to play me? Or, oh, you think I need to do extra practice? Or, oh, you think I need to run or this? Well, I'll just transfer. I'll just leave. I don't need to do that. I can go play at wherever. They'll have me. And I think what the transfer portal needs right now is an example of when you leave, and we have one in Olivier Sarr for sure, but you need more examples of, hey, just because you can go somewhere doesn't mean you should, because it's not always going to work out the way that you think. But the way college basketball has been going back to the Mark Gottfried years, we saw this every year. Guys leave, guys come in, guys go, you get guys back. It's kind of part of the deal in college basketball. So I'm not I like Manny. I like the way he has developed. I think he will be a really good player wherever he plays for NC State or anyone else next year. But we have a tendency to overreact when players leave and think it's the end of the world. Manny averaged 9 points and 6 rebounds a game. I'm pretty sure you can replace 9 points and 6 rebounds. Now, you're going to do it in a different way. Mm-hmm. But I like some of the players they have. It would be small ball for sure, which is what Kevin Keats did at UNC Wilmington. And the way that Kevin talks about Terquavian Smith, I know he likes him a whole lot. But you could counter, well, he probably said the same things about Shaq Moore, Joe. Well, okay, there we are. So I'm not the world's going to end if Manny leaves. But I'm also look, this is part of the portal, is that you have a guy like Manny who Kevin couldn't have treated any better in terms of playing time or development or anything else. But if another school is going to come in and promise you X, Y, and Z and you believe it, well, not a lot you can do about that.
It's almost as if it would be a good thing if these 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old men would have a older professional in their corner that they could look to for advice as to what would be the best thing for their career. But maybe we're getting there one day. I know you're probably in line with that mode of thinking, but That'll do it for our 2021 college basketball talk. Tune back in later this summer and learn the new roster. Thanks so much, Joe, for coming on. Ooh.
No, you can't leave now. We're going to do our predictions right now for football. We'll get them for the record.
Okay.
Crap.
Okay.
Since you're going to give me a hard time about it.
Fair enough.
12 games. We'll do 12 regular season games. That's it. We'll do the 12 regular season games.
8-4.
You're going 8-4?
Yeah.
Who kidnapped
off on him, Joe.
Wow.
What's wrong with 8-4?
I thought you were going to go 10-2, 11-1.
That's a tough schedule. Like 8-4 this year is much better than 8-4 was last year.
8-4 is my pick. 8-4 was my pick. That's why I was surprised. You're supposed to be the sunny one. You're the young one. You're the one who hasn't been tainted yet.
I have been around NC State for 23 and a half years now, so I understand how this goes.
All right, Matt, you have to be the ray of sunshine, the true believer. Bring it home. Come on.
Is this the year they get
one? You into at least 9-3.
But here's what sucks, because I was going to go 8-4, but now I look like they
No, that's fine. We can all go 8-4. Then you can't have me on. You can't have me on when they're not any good and be like, oh, you were wrong.
Honestly, my one concern, besides the schedule, how much are we putting into last year's success when maybe last year's success was last year's schedule? And some of the wins they got I like the variety of the wins they got last year. Sometimes special teams, sometimes that means you have a good team that you can win in different ways. But there were some games that you're like, do they really need the Syracuse guy to get mixed up on the last play of the game or whatever it was that happened at Syracuse? Or there were a lot of games like that. They were like,
it's going to be difficult to duplicate some of those wins. I'm with you. I'm with you.
Yeah.
All right, I like it. We're all here at 8-4 on May 20th.
And if they go 9-3 or 10-2, nobody's gonna hate on us, right?
Nope.
Yes, it's close. It's close enough. It's like the happy medium because the floor is 6 wins. It has to be. The floor is like 6.
Yeah. I would be.
So we're gonna be within 2. It's a good pick.
All right. Perfect.
I reserve the right to change my mind after the Mississippi State game.
Yeah. Oh, I was gonna say before then, but
okay.
So, all right.
Well, Joe, thanks so much for coming on. That was really fun. Listeners, go check out his podcast, Never Failed, The Russell Wilson Story, and go listen to his radio show, The OG, on 99.9 The Fan. You can listen in the Raleigh market from, 3 to 6, Joe, in the afternoon. The afternoon drive. I listen to it on the way home every day. So awesome. If you want, please follow us on Twitter. You can follow our main account at The Wolfpacker. You can follow me personally at Justin H. Will. And you can give Joe a follow at Giglio_OG. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to us. We're on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, Google Play. We're also on the Wolfpacker.com, where you should use that promo code PACK60 for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content, news, and analysis. Give us a like on Facebook, NC State Wolfpack on the Wolfpacker.com. And for Joe Giglio, Matt Carter, this is Justin Williams, and this has been the Wolfpacker Podcast.